The restaurant featured dim lighting designed to create an atmosphere of total exclusivity. In the center of the room, a large round table was covered in a pristine stainless white linen tablecloth. My family sat there in a circle, dressed in our finest attire as if celebrating a monumental victory. The aroma of expensive grilled wagyu and red wine filled the air, but for me, the atmosphere felt suffocating. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table in a suit that likely cost more than 3 months of a regular employee's salary. Beside him, my mother looked elegant, draped in a pearl necklace she repeatedly flaunted to the servers. Then there was Lily, my 24-year-old younger sister, who sat with the brightest smile that evening. For the first hour, the conversation revolved entirely around Lily's achievements. Lily had just finished her design course, Lily had just returned from a vacation in Bali, and Lily, according to Mother, was the true light of this family. I sat in silence, cutting my steak with mechanical precision, occasionally nodding when Father asked a trivial question about my work at the law firm. Suddenly Richard tapped a silver spoon against his crystal glass. The clinking sound turned our table into the center of attention. Richard stood up, adjusted his suit button, and looked at Lily with a sparkle in his eyes he had never once directed at me. "Tonight is not just an ordinary family dinner," Richard said in his deep baritone voice. "We want to celebrate a new step for our little girl. Lily, you have grown into an extraordinary woman. We want to ensure your future is both secure and comfortable." Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a dark brown leather folder. He slid it across the table toward Lily. "This is the deed to a property in Oak Ridge, $450,000, fully paid. It belongs to you now." Lily's eyes widened. She covered her mouth with both hands and began to sob quietly. Mother immediately hugged her, crying as if they had just won a national lottery. The server standing in the corner joined in with polite applause. The Oak Ridge property was an elite residential complex that had just been completed, a place everyone in the city despaired to own. "Dad, this is too much," Lily whispered, even though her hands gripped the folder tightly. "Nothing is too much for you, sweetheart," Mother replied while wiping a tear from Lily's cheek. Then, an awkward silence settled over the table as Richard's gaze shifted toward me. His smile remained, but the warmth evaporated instantly. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small white envelope that looked thin and insignificant compared to the leather folder. "And for you, Clara," Richard said, sliding the envelope toward me. "Something practical. We know you are a career woman and very independent. You already have your own apartment and a stable income. So we thought this would be the most suitable gift for you." I opened the envelope without expression. Inside was a Starbucks gift card worth $50. "Use that to buy coffee when you work late at the office," Mother added in a tone that sounded like pity. "You don't really need anything from us anymore, right? You can always take care of yourself." I stared at the small plastic card in my hand. $50. On the other side of the table, my sister had just received an asset worth nearly $500,000 for free. The contrast was so sharp it felt like a physical slap to the face. However, what made my blood boil was not envy toward Lily, but the blatant hypocrisy sitting right in front of me. They forgot, or perhaps intentionally erased the memory, that 2 years ago Richard's company was on the verge of total collapse. They forgot that I was the one who pledged all my personal assets and signed the bank documents as the primary guarantor so they could secure a massive loan. The Oak Ridge property they just gifted to Lily was actually purchased using the credit I guaranteed. Without my signature, that leather folder in Lily's hand was nothing more than a pile of scrap paper. "Thank you," I said shortly. My voice sounded remarkably calm, even to my own ears. "This is indeed very practical. I'm glad you understand," Richard said, sitting back down. "We want to be fair, but your needs are simply different." Fair. That word rang in my head like a broken alarm. I watched Lily busily taking photos of the deed to upload to her social media. I saw Richard and Mother return to sipping their wine with the pride of generous parents. They felt they had done the right thing. They felt they could continue to use my name as a financial shield without ever giving me a seat at the table of honor. I set my fork and knife down neatly on my plate. I took my phone out of my bag not to take a photo of the food, but to open my priority banking app. Under the table, my fingers moved quickly and with certainty. I searched for the list of collateral I had guaranteed. The Oak Ridge property address was listed right there. As the primary guarantor with full power over the credit risk, I had the legal option to withdraw my support if an asset transfer occurred without consulting the guarantor. I pressed the call button for my personal bank manager, Marcus. "Clara, is there something I can help you with during dinner hour?" Marcus's voice answered on the other end. "Marcus, I want to revoke my status as the guarantor for the Oak Ridge property loan effective this very second," I said in a voice loud enough for Richard to hear. "There is an indication of asset misuse without the guarantor's consent. Please freeze the transaction immediately." The laughter at the table died instantly. Richard dropped his fork onto the porcelain plate with a deafening clang. Lily stopped posing with her folder. All the color drained from Richard's face, turning a ghostly, terrifying white. I ended the call and placed my phone next to the $50 gift card. I looked my father straight in the eyes. "Wonderful dinner, Dad," I said as I stood up and took my handbag. "But it looks like I will have to drink my coffee somewhere else." I walked out of that restaurant without looking back, leaving them with the dinner bill and a mountain of debt that was now entirely their own burden to carry. The cold night air hit my face as I stepped out of the restaurant, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could actually breathe. I didn't wait for the valet to bring my car. I started walking down the sidewalk, the rhythmic click of my heels on the pavement providing a steady beat to the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Behind the glass doors of the steakhouse, I knew a storm was breaking, but I was no longer interested in being the umbrella for people who enjoyed watching me get wet. My phone began to vibrate almost immediately. It was Richard. I didn't answer. Then came a text from my mother, a string of frantic question marks followed by a command to come back inside and stop this nonsense. I silenced the device and slipped it into my pocket. They still thought this was a tantrum. They didn't realize that for me, this was a business liquidation. I reached my car and sat in the driver's seat for a moment, staring at the dashboard. 2 years ago, I had sat in this same car and cried because Richard told me the family would lose everything if I didn't sign those papers. He had played on my loyalty, telling me that as the eldest daughter, the family's survival rested on my shoulders. I had spent 24 months living in a cramped apartment, skipping vacations, and funneling 40% of my salary into interest payments just to keep their lifestyle afloat. And tonight, they had proven that my sacrifice was not only unappreciated but entirely invisible to them. I drove toward my apartment, but halfway there, my phone rang again. This time it was Marcus, my bank manager. I answered using the car's hands-free system. "Clara, the freeze is in place," Marcus said, his voice professional but tinged with a hint of concern. "However, I should warn you. Since you are the primary guarantor for the entire credit line, revoking your guarantee triggers a default clause. The bank will issue a formal notice to your father within the hour. Since the property was intended as a gift, the transfer of title is now legally blocked. The bank considers this an unauthorized attempt to dilute the collateral." "That is exactly what it was, Marcus," I replied, my voice steady. "They tried to give away an asset that serves as security for a loan they haven't even paid half of. I am protecting my own credit score. They are going to have to produce the full balance of the loan to keep that property. Clara, we are talking about nearly $400,000 in outstanding debt. If they can't pay, we will have to start foreclosure proceedings." "I understand," I said. "Do what you have to do." As I hung up, I felt a strange sense of relief. For years, I had been the one terrified of the word foreclosure. I had been the one staying up late reviewing their balance sheets. Now that fear belonged to them. When I reached my apartment, I found Richard waiting for me in the lobby. He must have driven like a madman to beat me there. His face was no longer pale. It was a deep angry red. He didn't wait for me to get close before he started shouting. "Are you insane?" he yelled, his voice echoing off the marble walls of the lobby. "The bank just sent an automated alert. You've put us in default. Do you have any idea what this does to Lily? She's devastated. She's back there crying her eyes out because her sister is a jealous, spiteful woman." I walked past him toward the elevator, my expression neutral. "This has nothing to do with jealousy, Richard. It has everything to do with math. You cannot give away what you do not own. That property is tied to a loan guaranteed by my assets. You tried to hand my security over to Lily without even asking me." He grabbed my arm to stop me, but I looked down at his hand with such coldness that he immediately let go. "We are family, Clara. We were going to figure it out," he hissed. "No," I corrected him. "I was going to figure it out, like I always do. But I am done being the silent partner in my own exploitation. If Lily wants a $450,000 house, she can do what I did. She can work for it. Or you can pay the bank the full amount tomorrow morning." Richard let out a harsh, dry laugh. "You know I don't have that kind of liquidity right now. Everything is tied up in the new project." "Then you shouldn't have been playing Santa Claus at dinner," I said, the elevator doors finally opening. "If you don't fix this by tomorrow, I will disown you," he threatened, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. "You will have no family, no father, no mother. You will be completely alone." I stepped into the elevator and turned to face him. I looked at the man who had spent the last 2 years spending my money while treating me like an unwanted stranger. "I've been alone for a long time, Richard. I just finally stopped paying for the privilege." The doors closed, cutting off his response. As the elevator rose to the 12th floor, I pulled the $50 gift card out of my pocket. I looked at it for a second, then dropped it into the small trash bin in the corner of the elevator. I didn't need their coffee, and I certainly didn't need their approval. By the time I entered my apartment, my email was already buzzing with notifications. The bank had officially moved. The war had started, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding all the weapons. The following morning, the sun rose over Chicago with a cold, unforgiving light. I woke up earlier than usual, not out of anxiety, but because for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of my family's failures pressing down on my chest. I sat at my kitchen island with a simple black coffee one I had paid for myself and opened my laptop. My inbox was a battlefield. There were 17 missed calls from my mother and a series of increasingly desperate emails from my father's accountant. The bank had moved faster than I anticipated. By 8 in the morning, a formal notice had been served to Richard. Since the Oak Ridge property was now flagged for a transfer of interest without consent, the bank had invoked the acceleration clause. This meant they were no longer asking for monthly installments. They were demanding the full balance of the loan, $385,000, within 7 business days. If the payment failed, the foreclosure process would begin, and the property would be auctioned off. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was Lily. Usually I would ignore her, but I wanted to hear exactly what version of the truth our parents had fed her. "How could you do this, Clara?" she screamed the moment I answered. There was no greeting, only a high-pitched jagged sobbing. "Dad told me everything. He said you called the bank because you couldn't stand the fact that I was getting a house and you weren't. You're ruining my life. My friends already saw my post on Instagram. I told everyone I was moving in next month." I leaned back in my chair, watching the steam rise from my mug. "Lily, did Dad tell you that I am the only reason that house exists? Did he mention that I've been paying the interest on that loan for 2 years while you were traveling through Europe on his credit card?" "I don't care about the technical stuff," she yelled. "It was a gift. You don't take back a gift." "It wasn't his to give," I said firmly. "You can't give someone a car that's still being paid for by your neighbor. Richard used my name and my credit to buy that place, and then he tried to hand it to you behind my back. If the bank finds out he tried to hide assets from his primary guarantor, he could face a lot more than just a foreclosure. He could face fraud charges. The line went quiet for a few seconds. The word fraud had a way of chilling the air. "You're lying," she whispered, though the conviction was gone from her voice. "Dad wouldn't do that. He's a successful businessman. He is a man who spent more than he earned and used his oldest daughter to bridge the gap," I replied. "If you want that house, Lily, tell Dad to pay the bank. If he can't, then maybe you should start looking for a job to help him. Goodbye, Lily." I hung up before she could respond. I knew Lily wouldn't look for a job. She didn't even know how to write a resume. She had been raised to be a trophy, a delicate flower that was never supposed to touch the dirt of reality. Our parents had done her a disservice by shielding her from the truth, while they had done me a disservice by making the truth my only companion. An hour later, I arrived at my office. As a senior associate at a top-tier law firm, my reputation was built on my ability to remain calm under pressure. My assistant looked at me with wide eyes as I walked in. "Clara, your father is in the lobby," she whispered. "He's been there for 30 minutes. He's demanding to see the managing partner." I didn't blink. "Tell security that Richard is not a client of this firm and has no scheduled appointment. If he refuses to leave, they are to follow the standard protocol for trespassing. Do not let him up to this floor." "But he's your father," she stammered. "He is a man trying to disrupt my professional life because he can no longer control my private life," I said, my voice cutting through the office chatter like a blade. "Handle it, please." I went into my office and closed the door. I had a mountain of work to do for actual clients, people who respected my time and paid their bills. But 10 minutes later, my desk phone rang. It was the managing partner, Thomas. "Clara, your father is making a scene downstairs," Thomas said, his voice sounding more amused than annoyed. "He's shouting something about you stealing a house from your sister. I told security to escort him out, but I thought you should know. Is this going to be a problem for the firm?" "Not at all, Thomas," I assured him. "It's a private civil matter regarding a loan guarantee. I've already contacted the bank. The situation is under control and it won't affect my billable hours or my performance." "Good, because he's currently outside on the sidewalk telling a pigeon that you read the devil." I managed a small smile. "I'll make sure the pigeon doesn't take him seriously." After I hung up, I felt a brief flash of pity for Richard. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the appearance of wealth and power. Now that the facade was cracking, he didn't know how to handle the cold air leaking in. He was desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. By the afternoon, a new email arrived. This one wasn't from Richard or the bank. It was from a law firm I recognized, a small, aggressive practice that specialized in family disputes. Richard was suing me. He was claiming tortious interference and seeking an injunction to force me to reinstate the guarantee. I laughed out loud in my empty office. He was trying to use the law to force me to stay in financial slavery. He didn't realize that I knew the law better than he knew his own bank balance. He was bringing a knife to a gunfight, and I had already taken his ammunition. I picked up my phone and called Marcus at the bank one last time for the day. "Marcus, I just received a notice of a lawsuit from my father," I said. "I want you to send the bank's legal team a copy of our guarantee agreement. Pay special attention to Section 12, the clause regarding unauthorized transfer of collateral. I want the bank to accelerate the foreclosure. Don't give them 7 days. Give them 72 hours. "Are you sure, Clara?" Marcus asked. "That will effectively end any chance of them keeping the property." "I am very sure," I said. "If he wants to fight me in court, he's going to need a lot of cash for legal fees. I'd hate for him to waste it on a house he's about to lose anyway." I hung up the phone and felt a surge of cold, clean energy. The war was no longer just about a gift card or a property. It was about showing them that the pillar holding up their world had finally moved. And without that pillar, everything they loved was about to come crashing down. The 72-hour deadline hung over my family like a sharpened blade. By the second day, the desperate bravado Richard had displayed in my office lobby began to transform into a frantic, disorganized panic. My mother, who usually avoided any talk of finances, as if it were beneath her, started calling my office every 30 minutes. I instructed my receptionist to divert all calls from their numbers to a dedicated voicemail box that I had no intention of checking until the weekend. Inside my quiet apartment, I monitored the situation through the bank's digital portal. The bank's legal department had responded to Richard's lawsuit with a counterstrike that was swift and brutal. They didn't just ignore his claim of interference. They used his own court filing as evidence of his intent to bypass the guarantee agreement. By admitting in a legal document that he intended to transfer the property to Lily without the guarantor's written consent, Richard had effectively handed the bank a written confession of a contract breach. On the final morning of the deadline, I received a notification that the bank had officially moved the property into the pre-foreclosure stage. The locks would be changed by noon the following day if the full balance was not settled. Richard's gift to Lily was now a liability that was draining what little remained of his liquid cash. Around 2 in the afternoon, my doorbell rang. I checked the security camera and saw Lily standing there. She wasn't wearing her usual designer outfit. She looked disheveled, her eyes swollen from crying, clutching a manila envelope. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. I didn't invite her in. I stood in the doorway, blocking her path. "Dad sent me," she said, her voice cracking. "He said you're the only one who can sign this. It's a restructuring agreement. If you sign it, the bank will give us another 5 years to pay off the loan." "Please, Clara. I've already picked out the furniture for the living room. I've invited everyone to a housewarming party next Saturday." I looked at the envelope she was holding. It was the same old tactic. They were using Lily as a human shield, hoping I wouldn't have the heart to say no to her face. I took the envelope, pulled out the document, and skimmed through the fine print. "Do you even know what this says, Lily?" I asked, my voice flat. "This isn't just a restructuring. This is an extension of my liability. If I sign this, I'm not just responsible for the house. I am giving the bank permission to seize my personal savings account if Richard misses a single payment. He's asking me to put my entire life on the line so you can throw a party." Lily looked down at her shoes. "He said it was just a formality. He said you're family and that's what sisters do for each other. Family doesn't ask you to go bankrupt so they can look rich on Instagram," I replied. I handed the document back to her, unsigned. "Tell Richard that my pen doesn't work for him anymore. And tell him that if he sends you here again to do his dirty work, I will file a restraining order against both of you." Lily looked at me with a mixture of shock and genuine fear. She had never seen me like this. I had always been the reliable one, the one who sighed and fixed the mess. The realization that the fixer had quit was finally starting to sink in. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice small. "The bank said they're coming for the keys tomorrow. Dad says we might have to move into a smaller apartment." "A small one, Clara, in a bad neighborhood. Then you'll be living like most people your age," I said. "It's called reality, Lily. You should try it. It's remarkably grounding." I closed the door before she could respond. I leaned my back against the wood and took a deep breath. It wasn't easy to be this cold, but I knew that any sign of weakness would be exploited. My parents didn't want a daughter. They wanted a safety net. And a safety net that develops a spine is useless to them. Later that evening, the bank's portal updated. The 72 hours had expired. No payment had been made. The Oak Ridge property was now officially listed as a bank-owned asset. Within minutes, the social media post Lily had shared, the one with her holding the deed and smiling, was deleted. The silence from her end was more telling than any scream. I sat down at my desk and drafted a formal letter to Richard's lawyers. I informed them that since the property was no longer in his possession, his lawsuit for interference was now moot. I also reminded them that I still held a secondary lien on his primary residence as part of the original bailout agreement from 2 years ago. If he continued to harass me or attempt legal action, I would move to foreclose on the very house he and my mother were currently living in. It was a total scorched earth policy. I was no longer playing defense. I was dismantling the entire structure of their entitlement, brick by brick. As I finished the letter and hit send, I felt a strange sense of finality. The property was gone. The gift was gone. The image of the perfect family was shattered beyond repair. I went to my kitchen, poured a glass of water, and looked out at the city lights. Tomorrow, the moving trucks would arrive at Oak Ridge, but they wouldn't be bringing Lily's new furniture. They would be taking away the last remnants of my father's pride. I had lost my family, but I had gained my life back. And as I looked at the empty space on my counter where the $50 gift card had once sat, I knew I had made the right trade. By the time the sun hit the skyscrapers the next morning, the story was no longer a private family matter. In the digital age, a scandal involving a prominent developer and a high-end property moves faster than a legal notice. The Oak Ridge development was supposed to be the jewel in Richard's professional crown, but instead, it became the center of a very public embarrassment. Because Lily had been so eager to post her gift on social media just days prior, the sudden removal of her posts and the appearance of bank officials at the property gate did not go unnoticed. I arrived at my office to find that the gossip mill was already churning. Several colleagues offered me tight, sympathetic smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They knew something was wrong, even if they didn't have the full details. I ignored the whispers and went straight to work. However, by mid-morning, a local real estate news site published a short piece about the unexpected foreclosure of a prime Oak Ridge unit. The article didn't name me, but it highlighted the financial instability of Richard's holding company. The fallout was immediate. Richard's business partners began to panic. If a man couldn't even manage the mortgage on a gift for his own daughter, they wondered what else he was hiding. My phone stayed silent because I had blocked their numbers, but my office landline was a different story. My assistant Sarah walked in with a look of genuine concern. "Clara, your mother is in the lobby again," she said softly. "But she isn't shouting this time. She looks exhausted. She's asking for just 5 minutes of your time. She says it's about your father's health." I felt a brief tug of guilt, the old instinct to run and help whenever a crisis was mentioned. But I had seen this play before. Whenever my mother couldn't win with anger, she turned to fragility. It was her most effective weapon. "Tell her I am in a deposition all day," I replied, not looking up from my files. "If there is a medical emergency, she should call an ambulance, not a lawyer." Sarah nodded and left. I knew I sounded cold, but I also knew that if I gave her 5 minutes, she would use every second to make me feel like a monster. She would talk about family loyalty and the bonds of blood, never once mentioning the $450,000 debt they had tried to anchor to my soul. An hour later, I received a notification from Marcus at the bank. The bank had successfully secured the property. The locks were changed and the for sale signs were being prepared. Interestingly, Marcus mentioned that Richard had tried to enter the building one last time to remove some high-end appliances he had installed, but the bank security had turned him away. He was now being treated as a trespasser on a property he claimed to own just 3 days ago. The social collapse was even more brutal for Lily, from what I could gather through mutual acquaintances. Her friends were already whispering about the situation. The housewarming party she had bragged about was cancelled via a generic text message. In our social circle, being wealthy is a requirement, but being newly poor or bankrupt is a social death sentence. Lily wasn't just losing a house. She was losing her entire identity. By 5 in the evening, I decided to leave the office early. As I walked to the parking garage, I saw my mother sitting on a stone bench near the exit. She looked older, her expensive coat looking slightly out of place against her weary posture. I couldn't avoid her this time. I walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. He's had a collapse, Clara, she said without looking up. His blood pressure is through the roof. The doctors say he needs to avoid stress, but the phones won't stop ringing. Investors are pulling out of the new project because of what you did at the bank. I didn't do anything to his investors, Mother, I said calmly. Richard did that by being dishonest about his finances. I simply stopped being the one to hide his mistakes. If his business is failing because I won't sign a loan, then his business was never actually successful. It was just a house of cards. She finally looked at me, her eyes filled with a bitterness that was chilling. You were always the difficult one. So hard, so cold. We gave you everything we could, and this is how you repay us. By destroying your father over a silly gift card? It was never about the gift card, I countered. It was about the fact that you were willing to sacrifice my financial future to give Lily a life she didn't earn. You didn't give me everything. You gave me a bill for your lifestyle. And as for being cold, I learned that from watching you and Richard ignore me every time I achieved something while you threw a parade for Lily for just waking up. She stood up, shaking with rage. You will be very sorry when you realize that money couldn't buy you a family at Christmas. I've spent every Christmas for the last 5 years paying your debts, Mother. I think I'll enjoy a quiet one alone for a change. I walked to my car and drove away, leaving her standing on the sidewalk. When I got home, I opened a bottle of wine and sat on my balcony. The news was now reporting that Richard's company was under internal audit by its primary lenders. The dominoes were falling faster than even I had expected. I looked at my bank account on my phone. My credit score was safe. My savings were intact. The heavy, suffocating tie that had bound me to their dysfunction was severed. I was no longer the reliable Clara who kept the secrets and paid the bills. I was just Clara, and for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. The professional fallout for Richard began in earnest on Monday morning. In the world of high-stakes real estate development, confidence is the only currency that truly matters. Once the news broke that a bank had foreclosed on a property intended for his own daughter, the confidence of Richard's partners vanished. By noon, 2 of his major investors had already triggered bad boy clauses in their contracts, which allowed them to withdraw their capital if the managing partner shows signs of financial instability or personal misconduct. I spent the day in a series of intense meetings at my firm, but I kept a private browser tab open to track the industry news. A headline on a financial blog caught my eye: The Oak Ridge Ripple Effect. The article detailed how Richard's inability to secure the $385,000 loan had led to a freeze on his other projects. It was a classic liquidity trap. He had over-leveraged himself, betting that he could continue to use my credit as a safety net while he funneled his own cash into speculative land deals. Around 3 in the afternoon, my office phone rang. It was an internal line from the firm's front desk. Clara, there is a gentleman here named Mr. Henderson. He says he is a business partner of your father and that it is urgent. I knew Henderson. He was a shark who had made millions by buying distressed assets. If he was here, it wasn't for a social visit. I decided to see him, but not in my office. I met him in a small glass-walled conference room near the elevators. Clara, he said, skipping the pleasantries. Your father is a mess. He's currently locked in his office refusing to take calls. He owes my group $2 million in a joint venture, and we just found out that the collateral he put up is tied to your personal guarantee. We also found out you revoked that guarantee. That is correct, I said, sitting across from him. The guarantee was specific to the Oak Ridge deal and a few secondary lines of credit. I found that he was moving assets in a way that violated our private agreement, so I stepped back to protect myself. Henderson leaned forward, his eyes sharp. If you don't reinstate that guarantee or at least sign a waiver for our joint venture, we are going to sue Richard for fraud. We'll take his house, his cars, and his reputation. But if we do that, the bank might come after you anyway because of your previous ties to his accounts. It's better for everyone if you just help us stabilize the ship. I looked at him and felt a sudden sharp clarity. This was the last trap. They were trying to convince me that I was still on the sinking ship with them. Mr. Henderson, you're a smart man, I said. You should check the updated filings from this morning. I've already filed a formal dissociation with the credit bureaus. I am no longer tied to Richard's business entities. If you sue him for fraud, that is between you and him. My assets are shielded behind a new trust I established 6 months ago when I first noticed his numbers weren't adding up. Henderson's face shifted from predatory to impressed. He sat back and let out a short whistle. You've been planning your exit for a long time, haven't you? I've been watching the books for a long time, I corrected. I knew this day would come the moment they stopped seeing me as a daughter and started seeing me as a line of credit. He stood up, adjusted his tie and nodded. Fair enough. If I were you, I'd keep your phone off tonight. Richard is desperate, and desperate men do stupid things. After Henderson left, I went back to my desk and sat in the silence. I realized that my father had tried to use his business partners to pressure me into submission. He couldn't face me himself anymore, so he had sent a shark to do his barking. It was a pathetic move, and it only confirmed that I had made the right choice. That evening, as I was preparing to leave, I received a final email from Richard's personal account. It wasn't an angry rant or a legal threat. It was a single scanned document. It was a copy of his will. He had crossed out my name with a heavy black marker and written nothing in the margin. Underneath, he had signed it and dated it for today. He thought this would hurt me. He thought the threat of losing an inheritance that was already made of debt and lies, would make me crawl back and apologize. He didn't realize that I had already given myself the only inheritance that mattered, my freedom. I didn't reply. I didn't save the attachment. I simply deleted the email and emptied the trash folder. On my way home, I passed a Starbucks. I thought about the $50 gift card I had thrown away in the elevator. It was a small price to pay to find out exactly where I stood. As I drove toward my apartment, I saw a billboard for a new luxury development. For the first time in my life, I didn't look at it and wonder if I would have to sign the papers to save it. I just kept driving, enjoying the quiet hum of a car that belonged to me, headed toward a life that was finally under my control. The gift at the table had intended to be my sister's crown, but it ended up being the spark that burned down my father's kingdom. And, as I watched the city lights in my rearview mirror, I realized I didn't miss the view from the throne at all. The reality of Richard's collapse finally reached the front door of the family home on Thursday morning. It was no longer just about the property at Oak Ridge or the lost investments. The bank, now acting with the cold efficiency of a machine, had moved to secure all secondary collateral. Because Richard had failed to settle the default on the primary loan within the 72-hour window, the cross-collateralization clauses were triggered. This meant that the house where I had grown up, the one with the grand staircase and the manicured lawn, was now at risk of being seized. I received a notification from my legal team that a lien had been placed on the family residence. Richard and my mother were officially living in a house owned by the bank. They had 30 days to vacate or find nearly $500,000 to stop the process. Since Richard's liquidity had been devoured by his failing projects, the chance of them finding that money was zero. I was sitting in my office when a call came through from an unknown number. I usually didn't answer these, but something told me to pick up. It was Lily. Her voice was different this time. The screaming was gone, replaced by a hollow, tired tone that I had never heard from her before. Clara, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Mom and Dad are fighting. I've never seen them like this. Dad is packing a suitcase, and Mom is just sitting in the kitchen staring at the wall. The bank people came by and put a notice on the door. They told us we can't take any of the built-in furniture or the appliances because they re-part of the valuation. I told you this would happen, Lily, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. I warned all of you that the foundations were rotten. I know you did, she replied, and for the first time in our lives, she didn't sound like she was blaming me. I went to a recruitment agency today. I told them I have a degree in design. They told me my degree is from a non-accredited school and that without a portfolio of real work, the most I can hope for is an entry-level retail job at the mall. Clara, they offered me $15 an hour. That won't even cover my car insurance. Then you sell the car, Lily, you get a bus pass. That's what people do when they can't afford their lives. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing, a shaky, uneven sound. I'm scared. Dad said he's going to stay with a friend in Florida to recalibrate, but he's not taking us with him. He told Mom she should have managed the household budget better. He's leaving us here to deal with the eviction. I wasn't surprised. Richard had always been a captain who jumped off the ship at the first sign of a leak, leaving everyone else to drown. He had used me until I broke, and now that the family home was no longer a palace, but a cage, he was running away to find a new place to pretend he was important. Where are you going to stay? I asked. I don't know, she said. Mom has some jewelry she can sell, but it won't last long. I took the job at the mall. I start on Monday. I'll be standing behind a counter for 8 hours a day selling shoes. Is this what it's like, Clara? Is this how you felt when you were working 3 jobs to pay for my tuition? No, Lily, I said. I felt worse because I was doing it for people who didn't care about me. At least you're doing it for yourself. That's a start. I hung up and looked out the window. Part of me wanted to offer her my guest room, but I knew that would be a mistake. If I rescued her now, she would never learn how to walk on her own. She needed to feel the weight of a $15 an hour paycheck. She needed to understand the value of the money she had spent so carelessly for years. By Friday afternoon, the news of Richard's departure to Florida had leaked to his creditors. Henderson called me again, sounding furious. Your father is a coward, Clara. He cleared out his personal checking account, about $50,000, and vanished. He left your mother and sister with nothing but a pile of lawsuits. I'm not his keeper, Mr. Henderson, I reminded him. And I'm certainly not his debt collector. We're moving on the house on Monday, Henderson said. The bank is fast-tracking the sale to my group. If your mother isn't out by 5 in the afternoon, we're sending the sheriff. I thought you should know, in case you want to help them move their things. I spent the weekend in a state of strange detachment. I didn't go to the house. I didn't call my mother. I stayed in my apartment and worked on a new case. But on Sunday evening, I drove past the old neighborhood. I stayed in my car, parked across the street. The lights in the house were dim. I saw Lily through the window, carrying cardboard boxes to the curb. She looked small and exhausted. My mother was nowhere to be seen. The grand facade was gone. The perfect family was now just 2 women in a dark house, surrounded by boxes of things they could no longer afford to keep. I thought about the dinner at the steakhouse, the laughter, the map with the deed, and the $50 gift card. The gift card was long gone, but the lesson remained. They had tried to trade my future for a temporary shine, and in the end, they lost both. I put the car in gear and drove away. I had a busy week ahead of me, and for the first time, none of my tasks involved saving Richard from himself. The following Monday morning, the sheriff's notice was no longer a threat. It was a physical presence taped to the front door of my childhood home. Henderson's group had moved with a speed that only comes when there is a profit to be made from someone else's misery. They had purchased the debt from the bank at a discount, giving them the legal right to clear the premises. I watched the updates from my office, receiving a brief text from Marcus confirming that the Oak Ridge property and the family residence were now officially under new management. By noon, my phone rang with a call from a hospital in the suburbs. It wasn't my mother or Lily calling this time. It was a triage nurse. My mother had collapsed during the final hours of the eviction. The stress of watching strangers carry her furniture to the curb had finally broken her. She had suffered a minor stroke, brought on by skyrocketing blood pressure and the shock of her new reality. I stood in my office, looking out at the city skyline, and felt a familiar heavy tug in my chest. For years, this was the moment where I would have dropped everything, grabbed my checkbook, and rushed to the rescue. I would have paid for the private suite, hired the best specialists, and promised everyone that I would handle the bills. But as I stood there, I realized that the woman in that hospital bed was the same person who, just weeks ago, had handed me a $50 gift card while giving my sister a fortune. "Is she stable?" I asked the nurse. My voice was professional, devoid of the panic that used to define my responses to family emergencies. "She is stable, but she needs rest and a follow-up with a neurologist," the nurse replied. "Your sister is here, but she's having trouble with the paperwork. She says she doesn't have the insurance information." "The insurance was tied to my father's company," I explained. "Since the company is under audit and effectively defunct, the policy has likely lapsed. Put her on the public plan or use the emergency fund. I will send over a list of her known allergies, but that is the extent of my involvement." There was a pause on the other end. The nurse sounded confused. "Don't you want to speak with the doctor about her long-term care?" "No," I said. "My sister is her primary contact now. Please communicate through her." I hung up and sat down. My hands were shaking slightly, but not from grief. It was the physical sensation of a habit being broken. 10 minutes later, Lily called. I answered, knowing she was at her breaking point. "Clara, they're asking for a $10,000 deposit because the insurance is gone," Lily sobbed. "I don't have $10, let alone $10,000. The mall job doesn't pay me until Friday, and even then, it's nothing. Mom is crying and she can't move her left arm properly." "Please, Clara, I know you're angry, but she's your mother." "She is," I said, "and she is also the woman who watched Richard drain my bank accounts for years without saying a word." "Lily, listen to me carefully. I am not paying that deposit. There are social workers at the hospital who specialize in these cases. They will help you apply for state aid. You need to go down to the administrative office and tell them the truth. That you are indigent and your father has abandoned you." "I can't do that," Lily hissed. "Everyone will know. The hospital staff, the people from the neighborhood, they'll know we're broke." "They already know, Lily. The sheriff was at your house 4 hours ago. The only person still trying to pretend you're rich is you. If you want Mom to get care, you have to swallow your pride and do the paperwork. That is what being an adult is. It's not about furniture and parties. It's about doing the hard, humiliating work to survive." I ended the call before she could beg again. I spent the rest of the afternoon working on a merger for a client. I focused on every comma and every clause, using the work as an anchor to keep me from drifting back into the role of the family savior. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to a small, quiet park and just sat on a bench. I thought about the cycle of our family. Richard was the predator, my mother was the enabler, and Lily was the prize. I had been the fuel that kept the whole machine running. By refusing to pay for that hospital deposit, I wasn't being cruel. I was finally letting the machine stop. Later that night, I checked my bank app. I saw a small transaction from a grocery store near the hospital. It was Lily, buying a sandwich and a bottle of water. She had used the last bit of money I had sent her for emergencies months ago. She hadn't called back to scream at me. She was, for the first time in her life, actually trying to figure it out. I felt a strange spark of hope for her. Maybe by losing everything, she would finally find a version of herself that was an unspoiled reflection of our parents' vanity. As for my mother, she would receive care. The state would provide what she needed, even if it wasn't the luxury treatment she felt she deserved. I walked back to my car, feeling the cool night air. The $50 gift card was a distant memory now, replaced by the reality of a family in ruins. But as I drove home to my quiet, paid-for apartment, I realized that I wasn't the one who had ruined them. I had simply stopped being the one who prevented them from ruining themselves. 2 weeks after my mother was admitted to the public ward, I received a visit that I had been expecting, though I didn't know when it would arrive. 2 investigators from the state's attorney's office sat in my conference room. They weren't interested in the family drama or the gift card. They were interested in the $500,000 that had vanished from Richard's corporate accounts 3 days before he fled to Florida. They laid out a series of documents on the table. As I scanned them, I realized the betrayal went much deeper than I had imagined. Richard hadn't just used me as a guarantor. He had forged my signature on a second set of documents to secure an additional line of credit. He had used my professional credentials to give his failing company a veneer of legitimacy that it didn't deserve. The investigators were giving me a choice. I could be a witness, or I could be a co-defendant. "We know you revoked the guarantee on the Oak Ridge property, Clara," one of the investigators said, leaning forward. "That move actually saved you from being the primary target of this fraud investigation. It showed you didn't have prior knowledge of his intent to divert the funds. But we need your testimony to confirm that these other signatures are forgeries." I looked at the forged documents. The handwriting was a chillingly close imitation of mine. Richard had spent hours practicing how to steal my identity so he could continue his lifestyle. He wasn't just a bad father. He was a criminal who had targeted his own daughter as his mark. I agreed to cooperate immediately. I handed over my private records, my emails, and the logs from the bank that proved I was at work when those documents were supposedly signed. That evening, I received a call from a number with a Florida area code. I knew it was him. I answered the phone, but I didn't say a word. "Clara, listen to me," Richard said. His voice sounded different, thinner, desperate, and stripped of the usual authority. "The investigators are sniffing around. They're going to come to you. You need to tell them that you authorized those signatures. If you do that, this all goes away. I have a new deal closing in Miami. Once it's done, I'll pay back the bank, and I'll give you double what you lost. We can fix the family, Clara. I'll buy Mom a new house. I'll get Lily back into her social circles." "You forged my name, Richard," I said, my voice as cold as ice. "You tried to destroy my legal career before it even truly began. You didn't just take my money. You tried to take my integrity. It was a business necessity." He snapped, his old temper flaring for a second. "I was trying to save everything. If the ship goes down, we all drown. Do you really want to be the one who puts your own father in prison? Think about the scandal. Think about what your firm will say when they find out your father is a convict." "My firm already knows I'm cooperating with the state," I replied. "And as for the scandal, I survived the one you started at the dinner table. I think I'll survive this one too. Don't call me again, Richard. The next time we speak, it will be under oath." I hung up and felt a wave of nausea. The man was still trying to negotiate using the same emotional blackmail that had worked for 20 years. He still thought he could buy my silence with the promise of a fix that was built on more lies. Later that night, Lily texted me a photo. It was a picture of her hands. They were red and slightly blistered. She had been working double shifts at the shoe store to cover the costs of our mother's medication and the small studio apartment she had managed to rent. There were no captions, no complaints, and no requests for money. It was just an image of the reality she was now facing. I realized then that Lily was becoming more of a person in 3 weeks of struggle than she had been in 24 years of luxury. She was learning the lesson I had learned a decade ago, that no one is coming to save you, and the only things you truly own are the things you earn with your own hands. The news of Richard's impending indictment hit the papers the next morning. His business partners in Florida had turned him in the moment they realized the state was involved. He was arrested at a luxury hotel in Miami, carrying 2 suitcases filled with designer clothes and $5,000 in cash, a pittance compared to the millions he had lost. As I sat in my office, watching the news footage of my father being led away in handcuffs, I thought about that $50 gift card again. It was the most honest thing Richard had ever given me. It was a clear, unambiguous statement that I was worth nothing to him. By being so blatant in his disrespect that night at dinner, he had inadvertently given me the strength to walk away before the ship truly sank. I called Lily and told her about the indictment. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just asked if the state would take the small amount of money she has saved for their mother's care. I told her no, that her earnings were hers and were safe. I'm going to see Mom at the hospital after my shift, Lily said. She's starting to talk again. She asked for you, Clara. Tell her I hope she feels better, I said. But tell her I'm busy. I have a lot of work to do. I wasn't ready to forgive, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. Forgiveness is a gift, and after years of being the only one giving, I was finally learning how to keep something for myself. I put my phone down and went back to my brief. The world was messy, my family was broken, and my father was a criminal, but my name was still clean. And for the first time, my future was entirely my own. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived with a gray, persistent drizzle that matched the somber mood of the courthouse. I sat in the witness room, smoothed my professional blazer, and waited for my name to be called. This was the moment Richard had tried to prevent with his desperate phone calls from Florida. He was no longer the confident patriarch who handed out properties at dinner. He was a man in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, facing the consequences of a lifetime of deception. When I entered the courtroom, I felt the heavy gaze of my father from the defense table. He looked smaller, his expensive tan fading under the harsh fluorescent lights. Beside him sat a public defender who looked overwhelmed. Richard's high-priced lawyers had vanished the moment his retainers started bouncing. As I took the stand and raised my right hand, I didn't look at him. I looked at the judge. The prosecutor began the questioning by presenting the forged documents. One by one, I identified the signatures that Richard had faked. I explained the technical details of our previous agreements and how he had used my credit history to bypass the bank's security protocols. My testimony was clinical and precise. I didn't add any emotional flair. I didn't talk about the gift card or the years of neglect. I stuck to the facts of the fraud. Did you ever authorize your father to sign your name on these corporate guarantees? The prosecutor asked. Never, I replied firmly. In fact, I had explicitly told him in writing that I was withdrawing all financial support for his business entities. 6 months prior to these dates, Richard made a low, guttural sound from the defense table, but a stern look from the judge silenced him. I could feel his anger radiating across the room, but it no longer had power over me. He was just a defendant in a fraud case, and I was the primary witness for the state. My obligation was to the truth, not to the man who had tried to anchor his crimes to my life. While I was in court, Lily was fighting a different kind of battle at the hospital. Our mother had been cleared for discharge, but she refused to accept the reality of their situation. She was demanding to be taken back to the family mansion, refusing to believe that the locks had been changed and the furniture sold. Lily had called me during a break in the hearing, her voice sounding exhausted but remarkably steady. She's throwing a tantrum, Clara, Lily told me. She's telling the nurses that you are a monster for letting Dad stay in jail, and that I am a failure for living in a studio apartment. She wants me to call your old friends and ask for money. And what did you tell her? I asked. I told her that those friends haven't answered my texts in weeks. Lily said, I told her that the house is gone and Dad isn't coming back for a long time. Then I told her that if she didn't get into the car and come to the apartment with me, I would have to leave her at a state-run nursing home, because I have to get to my shift at the mall by 4 o'clock. I was stunned. Lily had finally found her backbone. She was no longer the delicate flower who needed to be protected from the wind. She was the one standing in the storm, holding what was left of the family together. She had realized that our mother's fragility was often a choice, a way to manipulate those around her into doing the hard work. By the time I finished my testimony and left the courthouse, the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. Richard had been bound over for trial, with bail set at a level he couldn't possibly afford. He would remain in custody until his next court appearance. As I walked to my car, Henderson, the developer who had bought the family debt, caught up with me. That was a hell of a performance in there, Clara, he said, nodding toward the courthouse. Most people would have folded under that kind of family pressure. You're tougher than I thought. It wasn't a performance, Mr. Henderson, I said, opening my car door. It was an audit. I'm just cleaning the books. Well, for what it's worth, the Oak Ridge property is back on the market. We've had some interest. If you ever want to represent the new buyers, give me a call. I like working with people who don't blink. I thanked him but made no promises. I was done with Oak Ridge. That property was a monument to a lie, and I wanted nothing to do with it. I drove to Lily's new apartment that evening. It was a small, cramped space on the third floor of an old brick building. The paint was peeling, and the neighborhood was noisy, but inside, Lily had made it clean and functional. Our mother was sitting on a second-hand sofa, looking sullen and defeated. She didn't look up when I walked in. Lily was in the tiny kitchen, packing a lunch for her next shift. She looked tired, but there was a new sense of pride in her movements. She wasn't waiting for a miracle. She was working for her survival. I saw the news, Lily said, handing me a glass of water. I guess it's official now. Everything we thought we had was just a loan from you that we never intended to pay back. The debt is settled now, Lily, I said. Whatever happens next is up to you. As I left the apartment and walked down the creaky stairs, I realized that the hierarchy of our family had been completely inverted. The powerful father was in a cell, the pampered mother was a dependent, and the useless younger sister was the primary breadwinner. And I, the one who had been the invisible engine for so long, was finally free to just be a spectator. I drove back to my own home, feeling a profound sense of peace. The gift card that had started it all was long gone, but the clarity it had provided was the greatest inheritance I could have ever received. I had lost a family of shadows, but I had gained a sister of substance. 6 months had passed since the night of the dinner that changed everything. The seasons had shifted, and the cold Chicago winter was finally giving way to a pale, uncertain spring. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom, adjusting the lapel of my charcoal suit. Today was the final sentencing for Richard. The legal process had been a grueling marathon of depositions, bank audits, and uncomfortable headlines, but it was finally reaching its conclusion. I drove to the courthouse with a sense of detachment that had become my strongest armor. I no longer felt the sharp sting of betrayal or the heavy weight of obligation. I simply felt like an accountant closing a very long and complicated ledger. When I entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of old paper and floor wax. Richard was already there, seated next to his lawyer. He had lost a significant amount of weight, and his hair had turned a stark, snowy white. He didn't look like a titan of industry anymore. He looked like a tired man who had run out of people to manipulate. The judge didn't take long to deliver the sentence. Based on the mountain of evidence regarding bank fraud, identity theft, and the systematic embezzlement of corporate funds, Richard was sentenced to 5 years in a federal facility. He was also ordered to pay full restitution, though everyone in the room knew that his bank accounts were as empty as his promises. As the bailiff led him away, Richard stopped for a fraction of a second and looked at me. There was no apology in his eyes, only a lingering flicker of resentment. I realized then that he would never understand what he had done wrong. In his mind, he was a hero who had been betrayed by a daughter who prioritized rules over family. I watched him disappear through the heavy doors, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing for him. After the hearing, I met Lily for lunch at a small diner a few blocks away. It was a far cry from the luxury steakhouse where this journey had begun. Lily arrived wearing her mall uniform, a simple polo shirt and dark trousers. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were clear and her posture was steady. She had been promoted to assistant manager of the shoe store, a small victory that she had earned through sheer persistence. I spoke to the doctor this morning, Lily said as she sat down. Mom is stable, but she never had the full use of her left side again. She started attending a community support group. She still complains about the apartment, but she's finally stopped asking me to call your old friends for money. That's progress, Lily, I said, offering her a small smile. How are you holding up with the bills? I'm managing, she replied, and there was a note of genuine pride in her voice. I sold all the designer bags I had left. It was enough to pay off the rest of the medical debt. I'm actually starting a real savings account next month. It only has $50 in it right now, but it's mine. No one else has their name on it. We sat in silence for a moment, the irony of that $50 figure not lost on either of us. It had gone from being a symbol of my insignificance to a symbol of her independence. Lily reached across the table and touched my hand. I used to hate you for what you did that night, she whispered. I thought you were trying to kill us. But if you hadn't stopped the loan, I'd still be a puppet living in a house I didn't own, waiting for Dad to crash the car. You didn't just save yourself, Clara. You forced me to grow up. I didn't do it for you, Lily, I said honestly. I did it because I couldn't breathe anymore. But I'm glad you found your way out too. We finished our meal and walked out into the cool afternoon air. Lily headed toward the bus stop, and I walked toward the parking garage. My life had changed in ways I hadn't expected. I was no longer the reliable daughter who fixed everyone's mistakes. I had become a partner at my firm, my reputation solidified by my refusal to be intimidated during the investigation. I had a new apartment in a neighborhood that didn't know my family name, and my weekends were no longer spent managing Richard's crises. I reached my car and sat inside, looking at a small plastic card that sat in my cup holder. It was a new Starbucks card, a gift from my colleagues for winning a major case. I turned it over in my fingers. A $50 gift card had been the spark that burned down my old life, and now it was just a way to buy a cup of coffee. It no longer had the power to hurt me. I drove away from the courthouse, heading toward the lakefront. I parked the car and walked along the water, watching the waves hit the concrete. The family I once had was gone, scattered by greed and silence. Richard was in a cell, my mother was in a small apartment living a life she hated, and Lily was a stranger in a mall uniform. But as the wind pulled at my hair, I felt a profound sense of lightness. The gift at the table wasn't the property at Oak Ridge. It wasn't the deed or the leather folder. The real gift was the moment of absolute clarity that allowed me to walk away. I had spent my life paying for a love that was never meant for me, and today, the debt was finally settled in full. I stood by the water for a long time, looking out at the horizon, realizing that for the first time in 30 years, I didn't owe anyone anything. I was Clara, I was free, and that was more than enough.